The Thousand Sons are stuck in a narrative dead end. For the entire duration of their history, Games Workshop has done very little to move their story forward, or give meaningful change to a legion devoted to the great changer of ways. Ironic. From their very limited unit options to field a true Thousand Sons legion, to the fact that it took a couple of decades to be given anything more than just a bolter, their progression is slow and purposeful indeed. But before we get into today's topic of discussion, we all need the same baseline understanding. Ahriman's rubric, cast in an attempt to stop the flesh change from ravaging his legion, bound almost all Thousand Sons to their armour. From that moment on, they became phantoms sealed within power armour. Marine, Terminator and Dreadnought alike, they became a form of undeath. Those who survived the rubric, such as Ahriman himself, had their psychic powers dramatically increased, and theoretically their genetic curse stabilised. That part is important later. Now, Rubric Marines, these armour-bound souls damned for eternity, are practically immortal. While it is possible to destroy the shell of a Rubric Marine, the soul itself endures. Eventually, that soul can rebuild damaged armour plate and restore its war gear, waiting patiently where it fell, reliving fractured memories of a past life until one of its sorceress brethren calls its name once again. And today, I want to deep dive into one question: how do Thousand Sons replenish their ranks? For the Rubric themselves, this actually isn't much of an issue. We know that 1,242 Marines survived the burning of Prospero and escaped to the planet of the sorcerers, as mentioned in A Thousand Sons by Graham McNeill. That number would have dwindled slightly due to the flesh change casualties before the rubric was cast, but the lore also tells us that many off-world fellowships and fleets of the Thousand Sons, forces absent during Prospero's destruction, later found their way to Sortiarius, the planet of the sorcerers. Meaning the true strength of the Thousand Sons is unknown, but larger than what many of us had always assumed, that only those who survived Prospero endure in the current setting. Still, considering how heavily the Thousand Sons rely on auxiliaries like automatons, Zangor, and, despite what modern tabletop rules might suggest, cultists, it's clear they do not possess the sheer number of Space Marines like the other traitor legions, and honestly, that tracks. Even before their fall, the Thousand Sons struggled with recruitment and numbers because of the flesh change. What's interesting though is that surviving Thousand Sons sorcerers clearly feel the loss of every Rubric Marine. In the Battle of the Fang, a Pavoni sorcerer, Ares Foaza, attempts to escape the heavily damaged illusion of certainty. He teleports to a nearby Space Wolf vessel alongside 4 Rubric. 2 of these Rubric are lost within the warp, and a third rematerializes fused into the bulkhead of the Space Wolf's vessel. Only 1 remains intact beside him, and as Foaza looks upon the fused warrior, he laments. So few, now 1 fewer. Now, what's interesting here is the phrase only focuses on the single Marine fused into the bulkhead, not the 2 lost in the warp. The line isn't, so few, now 3 fewer. Maybe focusing on the single Marine is just poetic wording, or maybe it implies something more important, that Thousand Sons lost in the warp can be potentially recovered. This matters later on in the video. Either way, the scene makes one thing very clear. Thousand Sons are acutely aware of their dwindling numbers, which means logically they should be searching for ways to preserve or even rebuild their legion. And then we get something incredibly interesting in Ahriman Unchanged, potentially the closest thing we get to the creation of new Rubric Marines. Believing he had finally discovered a way to perfect a second rubric and restore his legion, Ahriman needed to return to the planet of the sorcerers, but Magnus's banishment was far more than just a symbolic gesture. Ahriman physically could not return. To break the spell, he had to return to the place where the original gateway to Sortiarius had first been opened, Prospero. His goal was to open a new portal, one through which his exiles could invade the planet of the sorcerers itself, but to do this he needed power. He needed the dead. And so he stirred the ashes of Prospero, the dead Thousand Sons, the civilians, human spire guard, even the dead space wolves. The echoes of the dead rose from the ashes of Prospero. They soared into the sky as columns of shrieking light. They pulled themselves from the sludge of tangled wreckage and splintered armour. They shook the ruins of Tisca with their pain. The novel then describes these animated constructs made from crystal, wreckage, discarded armour and ash. And once Ahriman succeeded in opening the gateway, we get this line. Out of the inferno his brothers stood, dark shadows of men cloaked in flame. The dead of Prospero were with them too. And later on we get the following. The host of the exiles spread through the ruins. Rubric marched through the rubble, firing, falling, and rising again without faltering. The dead of Prospero went with them. And this is where things get really interesting, because Ahriman effectively transports the souls of Prospero's dead to the planet of the sorcerers itself, souls now bound to fragments of armour and debris. So the obvious question becomes, could new Rubric be created from this? The dead of Prospero bore witness to Ahriman's second rubric. What effect did this second casting have on these lost souls? And considering the dead in question included not only those 1,000 sons who died during the burning of Prospero, but civilians, spire guard and even the space wolves, could this potentially create entirely unique forms of Rubric Marines? Could a sorcerer even direct a bound Rubric space wolf? Could they simply be pointed at a foe and let their base instincts take over, all the while being unable to understand why they were attacking? Oh, hang on, now that I mention it, that's very in keeping with being a space wolf. Then Space Marine 2 gives us perhaps the clearest visual example yet of Rubric resurrection. The sorcerer summons the soul essence of a fallen Rubric Marine and reconstructs not only the warrior, but even the discarded armour and war gear around it. Despite all of this, Rubric Marines can be lost permanently. Some may be abandoned, others destroyed beyond recovery, but honestly, that problem is nothing compared to the 1,000 Sons real issue. They're living sorcerers. Every true son of Magnus still alive, whether an exalted sorcerer or lesser aspiring sorcerer leading Rubric squads, is irreplaceable. These are warriors carrying thousands of years of knowledge, veterans of the Great Crusade, survivors of Prospero and the Horus Heresy, and they should not be dying lightly. Space Marine 2 has a horrible habit of depicting lesser sorcerers as slightly tougher but expendable enemies the player base has killed thousands of, but considering every mission consists of 3 Marines slaughtering entire armies, I'm not treating Space Marine 2's difficulty settings as canonised lore. Realistically, even a single Rubric Marine would be a serious threat to 3 standard Space Marines, let alone the lesser sorcerer. But the sorcerer can die, and unlike Loyalist chapters, who can recruit and train new librarians, the 1,000 Sons have no clearly established way of creating new, true 1,000 Sons sorcerers. Yes, they do recruit renegade psychers and traitor librarians from other warbands, but they are not true sons of Magnus. And honestly, the faction deserves some form of progression here. Even if it's incredibly rare or difficult, there should be some way for the Legion to replenish its own bloodline. Every other faction gets this by default. You lose warriors on the tabletop, but in your headcanon, those Marines can be replaced and retrained before the next battle. 1,000 Son players do not get that luxury, and it's about time that changed. Because without some kind of lifeline from Games Workshop, the 1,000 Sons eventually stop being 1,000 Sons at all. They just become a collection of random traitor sorcerers wearing blue armour. For anyone who's watched only Fools and Horses, this is basically Trigger's broom. Trigger proudly claims that he's had the same broom for 20 years, despite replacing the handle 14 times and the head 17 times. Delboy then points out, well, that's not really the same Legion anymore, is it, Trigger? And honestly, this is where the 1,000 Sons are heading. Games Workshop should advance the storyline, especially for the Legion devoted to Tzeentch, the god of change. Now, usually, Space Marine factions replenish themselves through gene seed, so let's talk about the 1,000 Sons gene seed. A lot of people, when you bring this up, will immediately tell you there's none left or it's too corrupted to use. But honestly, neither explanation is satisfying, and both leave the faction trapped in a permanent narrative dead end. The rubric is specifically said to have stabilised the flesh change among the surviving sorcerers. That means there is functioning gene seed within the living Thousand Sons. Yes, many sorcerers willingly embraced mutation afterwards, ironically becoming the very thing they fought against. But Ahriman's exiles, especially those operating outside of the warp, are often described with remarkably little mutation at all. Ignis, Kiu, Gilgamos, Galmata, and even Tessius, despite being described as dishevelled. These are elite sorcerers at the head of Ahriman's circle, even if unknowingly at the absolute peak of Tzeentch's favour, and yet none are described as grotesquely mutated. Which suggests their gene seed, and the gene seed within the other lesser sorcerers within the exiles, is not entirely unusable. And then we get perhaps the biggest clue of all, Yvraine. During the War of the Labyrinth storyline, Yvraine confronts Ahriman deep within the webway, where he searches for the Black Library and knowledge capable of reversing the rubric. During their confrontation, Ahriman suspends both of them outside of reality itself, holding their immaterial forms within the warp. And realising she's moments before certain death, Yvraine offers him something impossible: hope. A dozen of the Thousand Sun Rubric Marines, previously levelling firepower into the Reborn with the emotionless efficiency automatons, staggered backwards as if struck. They looked at one another, clutched their hearts and fell back, rallying around Ahriman before taking up the defensive stances of the Emperor's legionaries Astartes. Yvraine could just make out their words as they frantically sought to make sense of their situation.
Azek, is that you, brother?
Where are the Anethians? These are Eldar we face this day.
In the name of Magnus, what is going on?
For that moment, Yvraine had reversed the rubric. These warriors were alive again, confused, disorientated, wearing unfamiliar blue power armour, yet somehow still recognising Ahriman. And then, capitalising on the distraction, she scattered them out of the webway into the warp. Ahriman, abandoning his upper hand, chased after them. Now the story heavily implies these Marines died, but here's the thing: Ahriman survived. He's still a living character within the setting, meaning escape was possible, and if Ahriman could escape, why not them? Especially considering the Ahriman novels repeatedly show sympathetic shards of Magnus subtly guiding and protecting Ahriman and his exploits. It is entirely possible that Magnus saved them. It's also entirely possible that Ahriman managed to find some way out of the warp. He's no stranger to its currents. And this right here, this is exactly the sort of storyline that Games Workshop should expand upon. Not enough to suddenly give the Thousand Sons limitless new recruits, but enough to provide a lifeline. Enough for collectors and lore fans to justify new warbands, new sorcerers, new squads of true Thousand Sons. I have to assume that at least some of the living Thousand Sun Marines survived the encounter in the webway. If so, that would mean the Thousand Sons once again possess uncorrupted gene seed, even before considering the gene seed still carried by the living sorcerers themselves. Given that the rubric was cast, and considering the Elder Witch was able to cure their undeath, it seems reasonable to believe that these living Marines would no longer suffer from the flesh change, that their gene seed would be stable. Otherwise, the Thousand Sons remain trapped in a perpetual cycle of narrative stagnation, unable to progress in any meaningful way, something fundamentally at odds with the nature of Tzeentch, the changer of ways. To reiterate, I'm not demanding whole new squads of living Thousand Sons, but lore-accurate ways for hobbyists to come to terms with the death of their living sorcerers. Perhaps in time there is enough gene seed to justify the occasional living squad. I've spoken before about the limited unit options available to the Thousand Sons. Marines and Terminators, Bolters and Flamers. That's about all we get. There isn't much choice to the Thousand Sun collector if you want to field an entire Marine army. Perhaps living Marines is the way we finally get Thousand Suns Havoc squads. We also have to take into account the topic of my last lore video, in which it is very likely that the Blood Ravens are a successor to the Thousand Sons, and that Ahriman is well aware. That could open up an interesting story. The Blood Ravens, struggling with their numbers, now also have to contend with gene seek theft from the boys in blue. And while the Blood Ravens stealing meme is somewhat tiresome, having things being stolen from them would be an amusing turn of events. Finally, the later Ahriman novels show us exactly what Ahriman would do with a restored Rubric Marine. Helio Isindorus, the sole success of Ahriman's second rubric, is restored to life, albeit without his memories. Even though the timeline is eventually reset, making the entire arc of the last two books somewhat redundant, it gives us valuable insight. Ahriman keeps Helio under extreme protection aboard one of his flagships, hidden within one of the most heavily defended vaults of the ship. Which tells us everything. A restored Thousand Sun is priceless. So no, there's still no direct official explanation for how the Thousand Suns could replenish their ranks, but honestly, I think what we've discussed today is far more compelling than simply saying other traitor marines join them. Because for a legion obsessed with knowledge, destiny and impossible sorcery, surely the Sons of Magnus deserve a future beyond slow extinction. If you've got this far, thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like this video if you've liked this video, subscribe to the channel for more, and if you're happy to do so, share this video within your community as it really does help the channel grow. Don't forget to leave your ideas and theories in the comment section below, but in the meantime, all is dust, knowledge is power, and I'll see you in the next one.